so welcome back after the oil machine. For those who missed my intro at the beginning, my name is Amanda Rogers, and I'm hosting this session on behalf of the team behind the film and its impact campaign. A little bit about me. I'm originally from Florida, studied and worked along the east coast of the US, and now live in Scotland, where I actually had the pleasure of showing the oil machine at an event I organized outdoors. The large screen facing the North Sea, it was quite a magical experience to see the film being screened outside in Portsoy in Aberdeenshire. The impact campaign surrounding this film has been labeled After the Oil Machine for three reasons. It's about having a conversation after the film, sparking conversation among all the stakeholders involved. It's about exploring ongoing developments that occurred since filming was finished, such as Russia's attack on Ukraine, triggering an energy supply crisis. And also, it's about imagining how we can all move beyond fossil fuels. At more than 180 events in the UK, the film has already been successful in bringing people together to discuss solutions. Now we're very proud to be partnering with Bullfrog to roll it out to campuses and communities across the US and Canada. I'm joined today by the film's director, Emma Davie in Scotland, by James Marriott of Platform London, who you saw in the film mapping the flow of oil and gas. James is also the co-author of a fantastic book called Crude Britannia. And we're also joined by Ali Rosenbluth, based in Oregon, who works for an organization called Oil Change International, specifically on their activities in the US. So thank you so much, panel, for joining us today. And a big welcome also to all of you listening in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind, drop us a line saying hello and perhaps maybe where you're joining us today. I'll be asking panelists a few questions first, but then we'll be opening questions up to the audience. So if a part of the conversation sparks a question for you, feel free to write the question in the chat at any time. And our colleague responsible for the US tour, Marga Varela, will be moderating these questions and sharing them in a bit. And just one suggestion, if you're asking questions, start it with the word question or Q, so it's clear that it's a question to the panel and not just a comment in the chat. But let me first go to the director of the film, Emma Davie. I'm really curious about your original vision for making this film. You have previously made films with human interest and philosophical approaches, but why now make a film about oil?
I think it's one of the huge challenges for us as a community of filmmakers, how we articulate what we're going through as a species. And the challenge has been one that has been particularly difficult because until quite recently, broadcasters weren't supportive or interested in really supporting films that were looking at the reasons why we face the crisis that we're facing. With the holding of COP in Glasgow, we had a tiny little window where it felt that suddenly people were speaking in a much more open way about really what was happening. And I felt very motivated to make something that wasn't just abstract, but something that was very concrete. And I was inspired and very guided and, in fact, prompted by my friend James Marriott, who's here on the panel and who wrote, as you said, this wonderful book, Crude Britannia. James was finishing the book when he first mentioned to me, what would I feel about making a film about the book? And I said, certainly not, James. Far too difficult. Partly because he's managed to have access to all kinds of people in the book, including the then head of Shell. And not just that, but it's a literary work. It's not a film. And also, I really felt that it was a very complex thing to make a film of. But over the years, bit by bit, or not over the years, maybe over the months, bit by bit, it felt like by focusing just on what was happening in our own backyard and by really begin to understanding, in a way, the embodiment of it. And I was very helped by both James and his co-writer, Terry McAllister, in trying to understand that, to really understand what is the expression of oil in our lives, not just in the obvious way that we put it in our cars or that things are made of it, but in every way, ranging from pensions, finance, insurance, everything. And really to get a sense of this empire that we live under, because it is an empire. And the confusion of this empire is that we don't just inhabit it, but it inhabits us. And so, really, it's this complexity of it that I was most interested in trying to find a visual language for, and also trying to find different voices that would speak to it. I can carry on, but maybe you want me to stop for a wee bit.
Yeah, no, and it does that so well. Let's go from the genesis of the film and let's talk about the beginning of drilling in the North Sea and bring James in. So we're releasing this in the North American for a North American audience, and well, the North Sea may seem a little far away from them, but uh, could you talk a little bit about how the United States has been involved in the business, in this business from the very beginning in the North Sea?
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that it's the UK offshore industry, the oil industry in the UK, is basically an American machinery. It's an American culture. And there's a very nice line by the Czech writer Milan Kundera, who talks about the idea that the way a relationship is set in the first few days of that relationship. So we may have a long, long relationship of many, many years, but it's the first few days and weeks that sets the tone of the thing. I certainly know that experience myself. And it's also the case in the way in which the oil industry has operated in the UK since the mid 60s. Because in simple terms, the UK realized that there was oil, UK government realized that there was oil, probably gas, certainly, and possibly oil under the North Sea in around about 1963, 64. And began charting out the sea, as you see in the film. But very few people in the world had any understanding of how to drill offshore. The people who did were those people who had been doing that in Louisiana. And it was the industry in Louisiana that gave birth to the industry in the UK. And the crucial thing about that is that it's set the tone, the essential tone of the way the UK developed its offshore industry. First of all, that it was dominantly a private concern. It wasn't a state concern. It was a private concern. It was private capital that was going to do it. And it was driven not by, say, for example, meeting state needs or public needs, but about the question of how do you get a best return on capital. And secondly, it was absolutely a male industry. All the rigs were male offshore. And thirdly, it was a white industry. Race was built into it from the very first basis. And thirdly, it was an industry that wasn't really going to concern itself, at least until huge pressure came up to bear upon it in the 80s and 90s, with the question of the environment, the impact that drilling might have on the ecology of the sea. All of those things were ways of being in Louisiana, and they were transported to the UK, first of all in the southern North Sea. And just one thought, which is that if we imagine for a moment that it was done by another culture, say, for example, Norway, we might have developed the UK North Sea like Norway, where women were, right from the beginning, women were on the rigs, just like men, together with men. Secondly, it was a publicly owned state structured oil industry. And thirdly, they had a higher standard of environmental regulation. So it was born in the US, and we live with it as a US project.
So, Ali, you're joining us today to talk about the international picture and the particular situation in the US. I wanted to reframe that question I asked James a bit and ask you, how do you think this film is relevant to US audiences and US students right now?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. And thank you so much for having me. This film is really beautiful and I think really illustrates how this industry is so globalized, and that if we are going to fight for a livable future where we have renewable energy and we transition off fossil fuels, we have to fight it in a global capacity. We have to understand that what happens in the United States impacts what happens in the North Sea and vice versa. And I think that this is a really great way for American students to start to understand that and start to see this movement as one that is so has to be so rooted in global solidarity.
Yeah, and what are key issues that you're focusing on at the moment right now, Ali?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, recent history of US oil and gas is one of dramatic expansion. In the last 10 years, production of oil and gas has doubled in the United States. In 2022, 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil and gas produced globally was from the United States. And this dramatic expansion has really been driven by fracking in the US. Fracking in 2010, I think, accounted for 1/5 of US production. Now, in 2022, it's more than 3/4. And we know that that has also dramatically changed the landscape of extraction, concentrating pollution in certain communities, especially low income, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities. And just to put some of this into perspective, too, in 2022, the state of Pennsylvania produced more gas than the country of Norway. Texas and New Mexico combined produced more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia. And all of this expansion is feeding the biggest concentration of refining and petrochemical and exports infrastructure along the Gulf Coast. So while we have seen massive expansion of the fossil fuels in the United States, we have not seen increased weight of the industry in the US economy as a whole. The Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that there are actually fewer total jobs in oil and gas in 2022 than there were in 2010. In that period that I just said, we doubled our extraction in the United States. So talking about this global issue, right? Oil Change International, the organization that I work for, is an international organization. We have a team actually that are doing work in the North Sea to stop the expansion of drilling there. They're wonderful humans, and we're really excited that this is happening and that this film exists. But a report that we did that puts this all in perspective, right? It was called Planet Wreckers. And we released this in September ahead of the UN Secretary General's Climate Ambition Summit, where he was calling on global North countries to commit to real policies that transition away from fossil fuels. So we dug into some numbers around what countries are really pushing extraction forward. And we found 5 global North countries: the United States, the UK, Norway, Australia, and Canada, who are the countries that have the greatest economic means to rapidly phase out production, are actually responsible for 51% of planned expansion from new oil and gas through 2050. So we can see the ties there, right? We are in the global North, while we have the ability to transition to renewable energies. Our governments are still leading us towards climate chaos through this massive expansion of fossil fuels. And we are especially seeing that in the United States right now.
Wow. I mean, that's an incredible amount of statistics there that you've shared with us. One of the things I just want to say I love about this film, it's just, I mean, it's certainly an environmental documentary, but it's not necessarily an advocacy piece per se. And we've seen the film represent so many different stakeholder groups, but it's still so much more than simply a balanced journalistic piece. I wanted to ask Emma if you could talk us through some of these groups and your approach on weaving all of them together so well.
I think, as I was saying earlier, one of the aims in the film was really to try and characterize this oil machine that we live under, and not necessarily to demonize those who have different roles within that, but really just to try and understand what they feel about the period that we're in when it's clear that we have to move beyond it. So that was really what made me so curious about speaking to people who actually work within the oil industry. And maybe that's what allowed us to speak to them, is that we didn't have one. I mean, of course, we have an agenda of getting off oil. Bottom line, that's what we want. But I think it was important for us to really hear what their take on that was. So I suppose maybe that was what was very important both for us and for our broadcaster, that we were going to hear these different voices. Then the people who really inspired me and James too at that stage, who were on the rise, were the group of youth activists, and particularly Holly Gilbrand from Fort William, who was doing amazing work, just so knowledgeable and so incisive. And really, almost as soon as Greta started her Friday strikes, Holly started them. And in fact, when we were in the early days of researching the film, she was doing a die-in on the streets of Fort William, where she got all the locals to basically collapse on the ground and played some classical music while she tried to get people to really envisage what we were facing. And I thought, God, if this 11-year-old girl can make such a brave gesture, we've got to really pull our fingers out and do more. So I think that's really what motivated me, was thinking, how can we make a film that does justice to what that generation is doing now in terms of protest and what they will face later?
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's what really was the driver. Then the thing about this machine is it's really hard to see. Of course, if you were on an oil rig, you see oil, but that's not really what the machine is about. What the machine is about is making money. I mean, when you asked Ali what the links were between America and the North Sea, obviously the main link is that huge investment banks invest in the oil in the North Sea and make a huge amount of money from it. And companies like BlackRock and various other American institutions, who looked like they were going to pull away from investing so heavily in oil, have in fact increased their investment again. And I think this question of how capital flows in and out of oil was one that was very important to try to articulate in the film, and very complex to articulate. And if I had my way again, I would go into that in even more detail, because I think it is really where the big clue is in how we undo the machine. Because in a way, I think what the film's aim was that if we could really understand what is happening in oil and how this works, we would have the tools to know what to cut in order to stop the continuation of the machine. But if we don't know how it works, we can't stop it. So when we first made the film, people weren't really talking about licensing rounds much. I mean, in fact, James told me about licensing rounds and did this map to try to show me how it worked. And I remember saying at a certain stage, James, I think that needs to be in it. In fact, I think you need to be in it. And it certainly wasn't his ambition to be in it. But I think, as I'm sure you'll agree, he is so knowledgeable and has been researching this for the last 30, 40 years. So really has an incredible knowledge about how it actually works. And I felt very strongly in making the film that we as audiences, we as people living in a democracy who have a vote, people who are consumers, people who think of ourselves as responsible citizens, can't just claim ignorance. We have to know. And from that knowledge, we have to act. And the work that people like Ali are doing, and the various other people, in terms of being very clear about what actions we can take, seem to me to be the conversations that the film luckily has prompted. And that's really what the point of the film was. But I think it was important to say that I really wanted to hear the different people involved and really try to understand them. I would have loved it if one of the people in BP had said, we really are going to move out of oil. And in those days, actually, it looked a bit more promising when we were filming. We had Bernard Looney talking about BP reducing, their oil. And since then, things have changed in many of the major oil companies and actually got worse.
Yeah. I wonder if, James, you want to add to things that drove you to this film, add to what Emma was saying, to work on this.
Yes, I mean, first of all, it's a pleasure to work with Emma, a real joy, because I think for me it's an incredibly beautiful film that actually has beauty in it, and that's very important, because it's in some ways quite a dry subject, and it could seem very technical, but so it's incredibly important to, in a sense, seduce the audience to pay attention through the beauty of the work. The other thing I would say is Emma's absolutely right, which is about the shifting of the oil companies. As she mentioned, I've been working together with colleagues in Platform since the early 90s on oil and gas. And we tried several times to make films about it. And we tried several times to encourage the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, to put those on. But they were extremely reluctant to do that. Time and time again, like, no, this is not going to happen. And also, it was extremely difficult to get anybody from the oil industry to go on to talk about the industry and talk about the issues of it when they felt that there was an agenda coming to them from the makers of the film. I think for me, it's down to the skill of Emma and the team to actually get some of those folks to be on film, and it's incredibly important that they are. But it's also an indication of a certain moment in the history of the industry. As Emma alluded, basically this film was the first manifestation of this film came out just before COP in Glasgow. And personally, I would say that suddenly the BBC woke up to the fact that, hang on, we've got to do something about this. Let's put some money behind a film that's going to do this quickly now. And then they opened the doors to allow what we were doing to happen. And secondly, also the oil industry at that time in 2020, 2021 was very much on the back foot. You may remember that the oil price was extremely low during COVID. And prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the oil price remained pretty low, and the oil companies were on the back foot. Secondly, we had a government in the UK that was saying, we're going to do lots of green stuff. Even Boris Johnson was saying that. So they felt obliged to open the doors and be interviewed. And that was a wonderful opportunity. I think if we went to bang on the doors of the industry now, you'd find it would be much more difficult. They're much more defended, partly because the oil price is very high. And lots of people are pretty angry with them, but at the same time, they can sit behind that oil price and close their doors. So the film represents a certain moment, an amazing moment, actually. It was basically finally finished just about 3 or 4 weeks before the invasion of Ukraine, and the world changed. But that means it's a very special testament and very important testament. And I feel honored to be part of it and working on it.
So Ali, now after Russia's attack on the Ukraine at this time and the subsequent supply shortages, particularly with gas, a lot of focus has been on energy security. And a case has been made for the role of liquid natural gas that can be flexibly shipped all over the place. In your work, you've specifically focused on the role of LNG in the US. Why is taking that route not the answer?
Yeah, so I think we first need to talk about the impacts of the communities along the supply chain of liquefied natural gas, or what we like to call LNG. There are huge health impacts. There are carcinogenic air pollutants that come from the processing of this gas. Basically, you frack the gas, you build a gas pipeline, you cool it to negative, I forget, like 600 degrees. It's wild. It takes so much energy, and it is really intensive and polluting. So there's that impact. People around these terminals experience more asthma, more cancers, respiratory illnesses, all sorts of things. Then we think about the climate impacts. We know LNG is a source of methane. Methane is estimated at 86 times more potent in our atmosphere at warming the climate than CO2. So it is extremely detrimental to be expanding gas while we are trying to reduce the impacts of climate change. They both can't happen at the same time. And then there's just like the mass environmental destruction that happens at these terminals, at these pipeline routes, where people are fracking. I come from actually multiple LNG export fights in the US before I started working at Oil Change International. And I think some people just don't understand how massive these tankers are. These are the largest ships that are currently on the ocean. And that requires a ton of dredging. And that dredging has really severe impacts to the marine ecology. And also the communities that rely on them, whether that is the indigenous communities who have been harvesting food from those waterways for time immemorial, to the fishing industry. It's very clear that LNG exports and healthy ecosystems do not coincide. So we think about that first. Then we think about, we have the fact that where this gas is going, Europe and Asia are places that are also not wanting to perpetuate the harms, the public health harms brought on by drilling and fracking and processing, right? There are, countries in Europe who have banned fracking, and yet is it okay when it happens an ocean away? Likely no. There are still people there who are being impacted. Furthermore, fossil fuel dependence drives conflict, volatility, and instability. It just makes us less safe in the short and long term. And that's really important. If Europe is relying on fracking an ocean away for your gas, what happens when conflict in the United States or natural disasters in the United States have an impact on that? Your energy crisis, would also be in an energy crisis. And that is just not a sustainable or secure future for the United States or for Europe or Asia, anywhere else that is importing LNG from the United States. So, what we do know is that we have a very solid way to have that energy independence, that energy security, and that is renewable projects, right? Projects in our own communities where we can generate energy, we can have good jobs, and we can rely on not have to rely on fracking in oceans away for our heat and our cooking. And we actually just got some good news from the Biden administration around LNG exports. He's starting to see all these arguments and understand that this just is not a way forward. So he put a pause on the massive expansion of LNG. And we are going to be starting a process in the United States soon where the US Department of Energy is actually going to reassess how it determines public interest for authorizing LNG exports. And just to be really clear, this is a really exciting news that happened because of incredible organizing, a lot of which was led by frontline leaders in the Gulf, also a lot of which was led by young organizers. But this is only a win if we make it a win, right? Currently, it's just a pause on these authorizations. The LNG terminals that exist are still exporting gas as we speak. The projects that were approved months ago are still under construction. We're just not seeing new projects for the moment. So we need to fight to make sure that these projects are denied and canceled for good. And that we are beginning to see that just transition away from fossil fuels in the United States.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. I think at this stage, it's probably good to go to some of the questions that have been coming through the chat. And I'd like to introduce Amarga Varela, who's responsible for the US screening tour of the oil machine. Now that it's been released by Bullfrog in the educational market in the US and Canada, let's talk. Maria, can you tell about options where people can book the film? And can you share some questions that have been coming from the audience?
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here. Perhaps let's start with the question that we have from the audience. And it's a question for James. And they're asking about the fact that the investment of China in the North Sea oil is very alarming. And they're asking to provide more info about the extent of this investment and how this will affect the ability to move off oil.
Thank you very much indeed, Marga. That's a very interesting question because it also sort of neatly ties into some of the points that Ali was making and the point in the film. Viewers will remember that in the film we have quite a lot of footage of Grangemouth, which is a refinery and petrochemicals plant just to the west of Edinburgh. And Grangemouth is owned and run by a company called Petro-Ineos. Petro is a Chinese company, and Ineos is a private equity company based actually in Monaco most of the time, but nominally UK company, but it's tax domiciled elsewhere. And Petro-Ineos runs Grangemouth. And Grangemouth, 7.5 years ago, down the Firth of Forth came a ship, the first ship, which was importing LNG from America, from Pennsylvania, from Cove Point, I think. And LNG gas has been imported from America to Grangemouth over the last 7 years, constantly. There's a constant, almost like a conveyor belt. And Petro-Ineos and Ineos are building a new plant. They want to build a new plant, I think, in Port Arthur in Texas. So how does this relate to China? Because that massive petrochemical plant at Grangemouth is part owned by the Chinese state, or at least a company which is effectively an arm of the Chinese state, as well as this private equity company, Ineos. And so you can see that the Chinese government has a role to play in A, the continuation, and B, the expansion of Grangemouth, although that is currently under threat to some degree, and C, the import of LNG from the US into Europe. So the machine of the Chinese capital functions in that way, just as the private companies or private capital of Ineos does. That's the case in this petrochemical plant, which you see there in the film, but also, as I mentioned in the film, in the offshore oil fields in offshore in the UK North Sea sector. I think that one of the key points to be made that we do try and make in the film is that the way in which the holding of assets in the UK sector, either by China or by other state companies or even private corporations, essentially is a limitation on the power of the democratic structures of the state, this power of the UK state to rein in that development if they want to. Now, currently, the British state is working in completely the opposite way. It's trying to expand drilling in the North Sea and is doing so encouraged by private companies, such as, say, for example, EnQuest, which got a new licensing agreed earlier this week. And EnQuest is essentially a vehicle for both UK capital and American capital, including BlackRock, which is a major investor in EnQuest, and there's the company that Emma mentioned earlier. So it's not just Chinese capital that's driving forward oil and gas expansion in the UK. It's also other crucially private capital based in other states.
Okay.
And I would say, just to say, so because it's a private capital from the US, this is a US problem. This is an American problem as much as a UK problem.
Does anyone else want to add to
this? So interesting. And I just wanted to maybe ask James a question myself. We had a screening in Parliament where we were talking about, really, given that so much is beyond our democratic control, and the question of ownership is really at the root of that, and whether that ownership is from China or Norway, the same problem occurs. So you said something, James, that discussion after our screening in Parliament that I want to reference, where you said, really, if we want to tackle this flow, we have to look at the grid. Now, I don't know whether you have the same system in America, but it would seem that actually it was a very bold and interesting idea that actually the thing that we actually need to have control of within our country is the grid. So Could you just say a sentence about that, James? I know you could probably talk forever about it. I don't want to throw things too much because I know we're on other people's questions and I've just nipped in here, but it would be good just to hear the answer to that.
I think the key for me is that the development of the UK North Sea was a state project. It required state power to take place. It was the UK state that made the laws that divided the sea into the grids that we saw in that thing. And it is the UK government and UK laws that can say, right, this has to stop. And indeed, I would suggest that at some point that will happen. Whether we'll have boiled ourselves alive and the rest of the world alive before that, we'll see. But it will have to be the state that closes it down, just as the state opened it up. And as we move to a system of energy provision, which is from renewables such as offshore wind, the key tool in that system is the grid, the electricity grid. I'm not sure if that's the way you describe it in the States, but in the UK we do this, the national grid it's known as. And that national grid has to be under public control and it is used for the public good. Currently, the UK's public national grid is, I believe, partly owned by a Chinese company.
So, and just to be clear for our audience who may not know, our national grid is the system by which energy is distributed around our country. That's what the grid is, just in case you have a different phrase in America.
No, it's the same phrase in the US. You're good.
Good.
Not lost in translation.
So, Marga, just going back to you, if possible, to tell people who are on the call or on this event how they could options on how they could book the film.
Sure. So we're having this very animated conversation here right now. And this is exactly what we're hoping that will happen in so many communities and colleges across the country. And we're really thrilled to bring the film to the US. So we're offering a lot of options to bring the film to your campus or community. The first option is a spatial screening that people can follow with a panel discussion featuring some of the wonderful people that they're meeting here today, filmmaker like Emma or one of the subjects, James, and other people from the film team. And so that conversation can take place via Zoom, and they can have the film on their campuses or on their communities, and again, bring everything that they've witnessed here today to their own communities. Another option is to present the film, have a screening, and then organize their own panel, draw from their own community expertise or their faculty members or even student leaders, and just devise their own conversation, both talking about the oil machine and bringing it home to local issues. And we're also excited to offer other options such as multiple screenings for different campuses or different chapters of one organization, streaming license and DVDs. And all of these options can be explored by contacting Bullfrog Films or us as well as Twin Cities Media. And we'll be really happy to work with each school or each community to provide everything they need to bring the film to their communities.
Great. Thanks so much, Marga. Emma, you toured with the film in key colleges and universities along the East Coast, including my undergraduate school, Middlebury. But what were the responses you have been getting there while you were on the tour?
Yeah, I think we had very animated and passionate responses, and I think a lot of questions about how people could act locally. But also, I think what came out was also particular issues that are increasingly pertinent in America. One being, as has already been discussed, the LNG issue, but the other issue being the increase of plastic production. America is swimming in plastic. We're all swimming in plastic, but we spoke to many people that were very concerned about this, and including organizations who talked about there being a 60% increase in plastic production over the coming years, just because they don't know what to do with this oil stuff. If people begin buying more electric cars, as they are all over the world, what are they going to do with all this stuff? Force people to make more things out of plastic. So I think the thing that kind of really hit home in the States was this sort of mix of inspiration from places like California, where just while we were touring the film there were new corporate laws demanding disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. And there were things like that going on that seemed encouraging, but also other movements regarding the Biden administration's kind of slightly more reticent approach to the environment compared to what seemed to be promised when they first came in, and certain things like that people were more despairing of. But the big thing that we want to do in this screening of the film is not to wallow in despair, but to really think of ways of action. And that was really the advantage of the discussions, is within every discussion we talked about ways that the specific community could go forward, or specific individuals. A lot of individuals are leaving the film thinking about how they can disinvest their pensions. One student at one of our first screenings said, "Yeah, that would be great. I've only got $32. What can I do?" And we kind of were saying, well, you've only got $32, but you're part of a university structure, and universities in the States have been incredibly active in terms of divesting from oil and gas. So I think there were many discussions about how that could actually go more even further, and what would that look like. I had one student who came up, and actually we presented the film to a business school in New York, and this student was from China, and she came up and she said, "My family are involved in the oil industry and make money from it as a company. How can they change what they do?" So we had a really interesting discussion about that. So every discussion was very specific to the screening. I think I just want to say that, and I think that's the advantage of having discussions after individual screenings.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I want to bring it back to Ali here. I believe that there was a question from the audience around plastics. Marga, do you have that question available?
Yes, we have an audience member wondering if the oil companies are shifting their focus to put more emphasis on plastics now.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you put it quite well, right? The oil and gas industry their motivation is to continue extracting. When our demand for fossil fuels in our energy systems, because of whether we're reducing energy or we're getting more energy from renewables, these corporations are trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do to continue to make a profit? And a lot of that has been through petrochemicals, plastics. Actually, recently, OCI released a report looking at the impact of Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is his landmark climate bill. It does a lot of great investment in renewable energy, but it doesn't. What we found is that it doesn't constrain fossil fuel extraction and at all, really. And it wasn't really aimed to do that either, to be fair. But what's important to understand is that if we are just focusing on demand, if we're just focusing on what is the demand for fossil fuels, and we're not actually looking at what is at tightening and constraining the supply, the extraction of fossil fuels, the corporations are figuring out ways through petrochemicals and through exports to continue increasing extraction and continue expanding. And it's projected that, under the IRA, in the next 10 years, gas exports from the U.S. are going to more than double, and I think oil exports and the products that are derived from them, like these plastics and petrochemicals, is going to increase by over 25%. So that's just why it's so important that when we work on climate, and we have to be working to address what is the root of the problem here, right? We have to look at fossil fuel supply. And there are actually a lot of ways that the president can constrain oil and gas industry without Congress through executive action. And some of that includes ending fossil fuel leasing on public lands, which was something we were more hopeful for during the last election. He was moving towards, he made a commitment to stop the leasing of oil and gas in the Arctic. We saw him break that promise through approving the Willow project. Another thing he can do with executive orders is actually just, or through executive action, not even through an order, is just stopping the permitting of fossil fuel infrastructure. We saw him pause LNG authorizations, which is great, but definitely not far enough to stopping the expansion of oil and gas. And then we could also see through executive action phase out of oil and gas exports and the products derived of them, those plastics we're talking about. And that would really constrain the supply and truly, I think, get us to a transition off of fossil fuels, stopping the expansion. And then we can start thinking about how do we phase out fossil fuels, and how do we do that in a just way that brings workers along, and working class people who right now are struggling to pay their bills. How do we make sure that they are taken care of as well?
Yeah, well, thank you. Speaking of expansion, James, there's been a lot of talk of new licenses for exploration in the North Sea too. What's happening there now?
I mean, I often think of, I hope I get this quote right, but apparently President Clinton had a piece of paper stuck above his desk which said simply, "It's the economy, stupid." And if we want to understand the oil industry, it's money, stupid. And it's about return on capital. As Emma said, the only reason why oil is produced is that it can generate return on capital. If oil companies could make more money out of spaghetti, they would move all their production capital into spaghetti manufacture and out of oil, and we'd be awash with spaghetti, but we wouldn't have a problem of oil. But they don't, because they are focused on returning on capital through the oil industry, oil production. And the other thing to say is that, and Ali pointed to this, is that within the industry, they look at it we tend to look at it as this big, large structure, but they tend to look at it in different blocks. There's exploration and production, and then there's refining and marketing. And refining and marketing, obviously, that is refining complexes, but also petrochemicals, and also marketing, i.e. that's your gas stations. And an exploration and production, that's drilling holes in the ground and pulling it out of the ground, and crucially, moving it to the refineries. It's the supply system. And the money is fundamentally in exploration and production. That's where you make your money. That's where you make a return on capital. Refining and marketing is basically a bit of a mug's game. It's pretty cheap. You don't make much money. Often, I remember going to a gas station in the UK with a BP executive, and he explained to me that basically they made more money on the candy bars that they sold in the gas station than on the petrol they stole in the petrol station. And because it's the place that you make money in oil and gas production is actually drilling holes in the ground, that's why there's huge pressure for it. That's why the oil companies want to get hold of assets, want to drill holes, and they deal with the problem of what do we do with this stuff afterwards. That's why they have to go, right, hang on, nobody's buying this oil and gas, let's make plastics out of it, because there's a drive for production, and you see that in the States, and you see it in the UK, and you see it all over the world. And so campaigning needs to be constantly going back to that place of extraction and production, because that's the place that is really where the problem is. That's the problem, stupid. It's the money, stupid. And we have that in the UK. At the moment, there is enormous pressure to develop offshore oil licenses, pressure on the government to do that. And this government, because of their political makeup, have gone along with that. And we've seen a new licensing round. I won't go into the detail of what that means in terms of capital reproduction, but it means that there's a drive to do that. And we've begun to, just this week, see 24 new licenses in the offshore in the UK to be granted, which is frankly nuts. It's just completely wrong direction. But the only reason why it's happening is that there are people, such as the investors in BlackRock, behind EnQuest, who think that money can be made out of it, and that's why it's going ahead. And that's why they put pressure on the UK government, and that's why the UK government says, right, we'll have this. It's people wanting to make money.
Wow. And we've been talking a lot about the similarities between UK and US, but there's some contrast around legal. So in the UK, Greenpeace and campaigning groups called Uplift, headed by climate lawyer Tessa Khan, who we saw in the film, taking the UK government to court over these new licenses, granting the new licenses. But in the US, it's the state government, California, that's filed lawsuits against the big oil companies. And I just wanted to ask this question to Ali, or just maybe for you to tell us a little bit about what you know, what's happening there in California with that suit.
Yeah, well, first off, I just want to name that in the United States, we also have campaigning organizations, individuals, also suing their governments, because of either fossil fuel expansion or the impacts that they've experienced. There's these like landmark cases that our Children's Trust is holding in the United States as well around children's right to a livable future. So I just want to name those first. It's not just California that's doing it. It's not just states that are taking on big oil. We're also challenging states for not taking on big oil. But in California, just this September, they launched the Attorney General there launched a lawsuit against 5 of the world's largest oil companies and the American Petroleum Institute, essentially for accountability for the climate crisis and health impacts that California has been seeing. Also, accountability around knowing this information, knowing that their product was going to drive the world into more and more chaos, and actively hiding that information. So this lawsuit, it seeks to create a climate abatement fund, which would essentially force polluters to pay for the damages that they've caused in California. So this is a really exciting lawsuit, and California is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's really huge to see such a massive state taking on big oil in this way. However, we also can't forget that California didn't become the 5th largest economy without oil and gas. California is still reckoning with oil drilling, and we're seeing numbers drop in California, but the state is still granting new permits for oil drilling. And we actually, a few years ago, passed a historic bill to create a buffer distance of oil wells. In California, they're in the United States generally, they're often by schools and houses, by clinics. And so environmental justice communities in California led a campaign to win a buffer zone, and the California legislature passed it. And what was Big Oil's response was to challenge it, put that on pause. And this year, in the upcoming election, Californian voters will have the chance to decide whether or not to overturn a law that just protects people from having to breathe in the toxic pollution at these oil sites. California is also facing an onslaught of false solutions like carbon capture and storage, blue hydrogen. All are technologies that fossil fuel industry is pushing to continue this extraction. So while California is doing really incredible things by challenging big oil in this lawsuit and in other policies, the state has not fully reckoned with that grip that big oil has on it. And that means that there's just so much work for continued organizing in the state of California. Oil Change International, my organization, is part of the Last Chance Alliance, which is hundreds of groups throughout California, nationally and internationally, to put pressure on the governor, Gavin Newsom, to rise to this moment and, do all that he can for the health and safety of Californians, but also for our climate.
Thanks so much. I mean, really important. So I want to just ask one last question that's from the audience to all three of you. I mean, this film really explains how urgent this topic is, and I want to. What can we do as individuals to fight for systematic change now? Emma.
I think one thing I just want to say is maybe it's about an approach. I think when we showed the film, some people would be saying, oh, I just feel like I've been an activist for so long. I'm beginning to feel that I'm losing my energy. And I guess I just want to say, don't give up. I think that's the biggest thing that I feel really passionately about. There are many different things, whether you're going to move your money or whatever you're going to do, but never forget that human beings made this machine and human beings can dismantle it. It's possible.
Great, thanks. Ali, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I love how this question is framed, because it's not asking like, what can I do as an individual, change my banking or, buy recycled toilet paper. It's asking, what can I do as an individual to be involved in systemic change, which is such an important way to think about this. The fossil fuel industry is driving this crisis. They are responsible for the majority of the emissions that are, again, driving this crisis. And we have to respond to this moment with that information and look and directly confront the institutions and the corporations that are doing this to us and to our planet. So I always tell folks that there's, no matter where you live, there are local campaigns to get involved with. There are, whether it's in your city council, whether it's a project that is being built near you, whether it's, building solidarity between your community and another community that is facing the impacts of fossil fuel expansion. There's endless campaigning to do. So figure out what's happening in your community, get involved. And when there's opportunities to be on the streets to show our power as people, take those opportunities. Just in September, in New York City, we had a march of 75,000 people. And that coincided with a global mobilization to end fossil fuels, which had actions taking place on all 7 continents. And that demonstration of power is so critical and so huge, and actually made strides to what, not just what we received from the Biden administration with this LNG pause, but also at COP this year in Dubai, for the first time ever, we saw the words transition off fossil fuels in the text. And while it's full of loopholes and has such a far way to go, that would have never happened without people making it really clear all over the world that we understand what is driving the climate crisis and that we are standing up against it, and that we, as people with huge numbers all over the world, can stand together and take it down.
Nice.
James, what will you add to this?
I just like to say that I've been, as you mentioned, Amanda, we've been showing the film around in community events and cinemas in the UK. And I have to say that I found it immensely inspiring to have Q&As after that film showing, because I constantly have met amazing individuals in communities and places and towns all over the UK who are doing stuff. I mean, it's just amazing how much people are doing. Recently, somebody said to me, I was asked on the panel, said, give it in one word, what should we do in response to this film? Which is quite a challenge for one word. And I said, that is simple, everything. The one word is everything. We should do everything. And by that, I mean, not everybody can find it in their soul to lock themselves onto an oil tanker. And not everybody finds it in their soul to think that it's a thing of value to refuse a plastic bag. But all of those actions, refusing a plastic bag or bolting yourself onto an oil tank or a road tanker, are valuable things, and we need to act on in everything. That's one thing I would say. The second is that we need to do something which is in some ways rather curious, which is exist in two time frames, both the now and the long term. I find it interesting that, you know, when you fall in love, you kiss somebody in the first moment, and that is a now. But you might dream and think for a long time and imagine for a long time. And at that point in your heart, you exist in two time frames. And I think we have to do the same in relation to this, which is that we have to act now because, of course, time is pressing in relation to the amount of the impact of climate change. But we also have to look very long. As Ali said, you know, it's a very amazing thing that in the statement of the COP in Dubai, they said the problem is fossil fuels. Whew, okay, it's not nirvana, but it's taken 30 years to get there. Okay, but it's taken 30 years because people pushed hard. And 30 years in the oil industry's point of view is nothing. BP recently agreed to and put the final investments on a project in the North Sea. Their time frame is 50 years. The oil industry thinks over a long period of time. And if we are going to be successful, we need to do two things at the same time. The moment of that first kiss and the long-term imagination. We need to act now, but also to say, okay, we're going to do this over a long period of time. And as Emma says, don't give up. Keep going. Keep going. It's going to be tricky, but keep going. If people hadn't kept going and pushing on the COP process, we wouldn't have got those few words into that statement. And if people don't keep going, then we won't turn those into the key tool that they actually are. They are like a key in a lock. And we have to keep going so that we turn that key and deliver what we need to deliver, which is the end of the oil and gas industry. Boom.
That's a really good way to end, really inspiring. And I just want to thank James, Emma, and Ali for being here and sharing your knowledge and expertise. I really, really appreciate it. And just a quick reminder, if you plan to show the film, James and Emma are available to be part of the discussion as part of your screenings, preferably virtually to save on fossil fuels. But a similar conversation such as this, perhaps alongside other experts locally, could be organized. So as we close this event now, let's quickly recap on how people can use the film. So we'll leave this slide up for you as a summary and Bullfrog will also send you more information over email. But this wraps our event today, and I just thank you so much for taking the time to watch the film, and thank you again for all of your this lively discussion that we had. I really learned a lot myself.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.